This episode of the Vincast is proudly supported by Sheba, Australia's first and only active all-female rideshare service getting women and children where they need to go. You can use Sheba in Melbourne, Geelong, Sydney, Brisbane, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast, and it will be available in Perth, Darwin and Adelaide soon. On episode 127 of the Vincast, I chat with Ben Ranken, chief winemaker for Galli Estate and also owner of Wilimee Vineyard in Macedon. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Garsbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And as I mentioned on the last episode of the podcast, super excited to be co-hosting the first ever live edition of the podcast on the 5th of December here in Melbourne. I'm going to be co-hosting that with fellow podcaster Nevena Spirovska, who hosts a podcast called Quickie, and we are both part of the Earbuds Network, the awesome Melbourne podcast network, and we are going to be chatting about grape variety. So the topic that I've selected is what are the, in inverted commas, right grape varieties for Australian wine. And along with Nevena and I will be former podcast guest Dan Buckle, who is the chief winemaker at Shandon, Australia, and also makes some wines under his own brand, Cersei Wines. And also the podcast guest for this episode, Ben Ranken. Ben has been for many years the chief winemaker for Galli Estate. They have a winery and also a vineyard in Sunbury, and then also another vineyard in Heathcote, where they grow quite a lot of alternative varieties, Italian and Spanish. And I thought the two of them would make for really interesting guests to have a discussion about what are the right varieties in Australia. So I'm super excited. Please do head to the Earbuds Facebook page or to the Intrepid Wino Facebook page. There is a link to the event and you can secure some tickets. They're really, really cheap, I think, for the event. $30, which includes a tasting of some wines as well. And it's going to be held at Noisy Ritual, which is owned by another former guest of the podcast, Alex Byrne. It's also where I made my first wine. So please do check it out and hope to see you there. I'm looking forward to possibly meeting a lot of you in person. But yeah, as I mentioned, this week's episode is with Ben Ranken. It was great to catch up with him a little while ago. I did also have an opportunity to taste some Galli Estate wine, so do head to my YouTube channel and check out the Let's Taste videos there. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Ben, thank you very much for making some time to be on the Vincast. It's great to sit down and chat with you. Welcome on the show.
Thanks, James. Thank you.
I start every episode by asking my guest if they can remember if there was a certain event in their life that made them think about wine in a different way and possibly set them on the path, or was it a gradual thing where you sort of thought, oh, wine, that'd be an interesting career path?
Right, a good question. I haven't thought about that. I guess I grew up on a vineyard, so...
Whereabouts was that?
Tumbarumba in southern New South Wales.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So,
good Chardonnay.
Yeah, you bet. Well, that was Mum and Dad, one of the first to plant a vineyard there. I think it was 84.
Wow.
Or thereabouts. So I guess I was immersed in viticulture in particular, not so much winemaking.
Okay.
But it was also a side project for my parents on the farm.
So were they from that area and they decided to plant a vineyard, or did they move there to plant a vineyard?
No. They moved there when I was a couple of years old to be sheep farmers.
Okay.
And then about 6-7 years later, they planted a vineyard.
Mm-hmm.
And they were always interested in, they're actually foresters, horticulturalists, so they're always interested in planting trees. So a vineyard was obviously pretty easy, and considering someone had done it the year before, that was the first vineyard, Ian Cow in Tumba. they went into it all guns blazing.
Yep.
And I grew up on a vineyard in the sense of helping them plant the vines, put the irrigation in, the posts, the whole lot.
Wow.
And then they expanded that later on in the probably early 90s, and I was at boarding school, so my school holidays, summer, winter, the whole lot was always in the vineyard helping with pruning or harvesting or some sort of irrigation work. There's always irrigation work to be done.
Did you enjoy that, or was that kind of a?
No, I loved it. I loved the physical labour.
Great.
Being a young bloke, of course, fit when you're playing footy and all that sort of stuff.
Sure.
Any sort of physical labour was great.
Sure.
Keep you fit and active and all the rest of it. And there's obviously an element of mum and dad, saying, hey, you've got to earn your keep here for the holidays. Go out and help out in the vineyard or what have you. And there's also other stuff on the farm as well, fixing fences and what have you. So I guess going back to your question, I was probably immersed in viticulture and was more interested in viticulture to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So,
did you have any ideas about what you wanted to do, like when you finished school, or like whether you went to study, or did you have an idea that maybe wine might have been a career path?
No, wine didn't come along for a few more years later.
Okay.
I didn't know what I wanted to do after school. It was all I knew was I wanted to be part outdoors and part indoors. That was my only prerequisite. So I remember going through the university, logbook or whatever you want to call it, to find out what jobs I should try and enrol in for a university path.
Right.
And I ended up enrolling in surveying and cartography.
Yeah. Okay.
At
Makes sense.
RMIT. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So because I knew there was a bit of both, indoors, outdoors.
Yep.
And that was interesting. But I think life in Melbourne was more fun.
Sure. So was that part of the reason you kind of wanted to go and live in the big city? Where were you going to boarding school?
Oh, I went to school in Geelong.
Right.
So,
Okay.
Yes, it was a 5-hour drive from mum and dad. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously holidays were pretty important at home. But obviously Melbourne was an obvious choice, obviously. And so at RMIT, I took a gap year, travelled around and what have you, and actually worked on a lot of vineyards actually in my gap year before university. And travelling up the east coast of Australia as well. Surveying was interesting because it was obviously that outdoors facet.
Yep.
But the beer drinking life of a university student in Melbourne took over, and so I did that for 3 years, and that was fun. And then I actually failed 2 years in a row because my social life overtook my university life. So,
Sounds familiar.
I think there's a lot of people like that who had a great time. So then I thought, well, what am I going to do? So that's when viticulture came on the radar.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at applying to Charles Sturt. This would have been mid to late 90s. And on the application forms to apply for viticulture or winemaking, the harder entrance score was winemaking. So I put that first and viticulture second, expecting to get into viticulture. And I was accepted into winemaking, and I'm like, shit, righto, let's give this a go.
Right.
So I sort of went into winemaking, not really knowing much about it, but knowing more about the viticulture.
Do you think that potentially helped you as far as the studies and then, working as a winemaker, having spent time working in vineyards and to certainly say growing up in them? Because I would imagine that there would be a lot of people who have experience in neither, who go and study winemaking, and it's sort of like learning backwards, whereas you kind of already had that experience of understanding what goes into the actual growing of the grapes to then kind of go, okay, so now we start from here, and this is what we end up with. Yeah,
that's spot on. Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of people forget that winemaking is farming.
Yeah,
we're in the farming agricultural industry.
Yeah.
And you can't make good wine out of bad grapes. So the viticulture is number one. So
Sure.
we're farmers essentially. And
Sure.
growing up on a farm, that was obviously what I loved, but didn't really know it until I got into it, so to speak. So there was good grounding having a viticulture background. And I found all those subjects at university studying winemaking because there's a crossover of the two, viticulture and winemaking, in the winemaking course.
Yeah.
So studying the viticultural subjects was water off a duck's back for me. I found that really easy and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then the challenge was the science of the winemaking part for me, because I was more interested in the biology and the plant physiology and vineyards rather than the chemistry and the so forth.
Yeah.
So my challenge was more that chemistry, scientific background for winemaking.
Absolutely.
But at the end of the day, that's just to get a piece of paper to say you're a winemaker.
Right. You would have had a bit of a leg up, though, compared to some of your fellow students, because you've got kind of the vineyard stuff, the viticulture.
Yeah, there was a few of us,
so you could focus a lot more on the area that you were less experienced in.
Yeah, definitely, mate, definitely. And there's a few of us in our class who are, obviously from winemaking or grape growing backgrounds,
mm-hmm.
Who are still in the industry today.
Yep. To get that, but they were there to get that qualification and get
exactly
a much
But they already
stronger.
had the grounding as well, so we were always stronger than a lot of the other students.
Sure.
Although in saying that, there were students who came through from scientific backgrounds. They might have done engineering or science degrees beforehand, so they found the winemaking part more easy than the viticultural part, so to speak, because their grounding was more scientific. So
well, like when I
was different.
When I went to the University of Adelaide and did the Masters in Wine Business, by that point I'd already been working for a winery, and particularly in marketing. So the marketing elements of the degree weren't as difficult for me, but I had to work a lot harder on the financial and the winemaking side of things.
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, it didn't really click for me. Winemaking didn't really click for me until I got out of university and did your last 2 years by correspondence.
So you were working in a winery?
Yeah, I went down to De Bortoli's in the Yarra.
Right, okay.
And that's where I sort of started my first winemaking journey. And that's when it all clicked. It was like, oh, geez, I should have done this years beforehand, because the winemaking made so much more sense when you put it into theory. So I put it into practice rather than theory at university. So that's when it all clicked. That experience is number one, obviously.
And working at De Bortoli in the Yarra Valley, I mean, what an amazing team that would have been. And you would have been working with some people who have since gone on to do amazing things as well.
We had an amazing group of people back then. That would have been, I think 2001 was my first vintage. So
was Bill Downey there?
Yeah. There was we had a great crew. We had obviously Steve Webber, David Slingsby Siff, who's since passed away, and Dave Bicknell from Oak Ridge.
Right.
Were our three winemakers, I suppose.
Yep.
And then as cellar hands, we had Bill Downey, Paul Bridgman, who's now at Levitine, Glenn Thompson, who's now at DC.
Yep, I used to work with him.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yep. And obviously Sarah Fagan, who's still there. Anthony Brain, who's now Livewire over in the Bellarine.
Yeah, right.
We have, who else is there? I'm sure I'm missing a couple. Oh, sorry, Adam McCallum, who's now a winemaker at Tarawara.
Uh-huh.
So, we had a great crew and great people. They were awesome. And it was the best grounding to start a winemaking career. Certainly, it was all about work ethic at De Bortoli's in those days. We had 5,000 barrels on stillage. You had to plumb bob all your stillage and get it perfectly straight. 110 barrels per row, 4 high.
Discipline,
all right. And it was phenomenal. It was great fun. We worked bloody hard, but it was fantastic. What we got out of it, the play hard, work hard was, it was brilliant. We had a greint time. So.
Yeah. How long did you end up working there?
I did four vintages, 3 years full time, and then they helped me with my first stint overseas from there on.
Right.
So
where was that?
Fortunately enough, Burgundy. In 2003.
Good place to start.
Yeah, it was probably too good a place to start. I wish I know what I know now. Compared to what I knew then.
2003 vintage.
Yeah, so the hot one.
Oh,
the hot one.
Challenging.
Yeah, it was. It was hot.
For Burgundy in particular, would have been challenging.
Yeah, it was. I think it's been one of the hottest in Record 03 for them. I flew into Paris mid-August, and I was expecting to have a fortnight in Paris, find your feet. First time I ever travelled too, by the way.
Yeah.
And then I got the email saying,
"Get the F down here."
Yeah, we started picking yesterday.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, crikey.
Right. But
it was brilliant. It was great. And I did 3 months there, so it wasn't just harvest, it was also post. And I was really fortunate. And, and I probably did 3 or 4 vintages in Europe. My first 3 or 4 vintages in Europe were all sort of, for free. You just get paid your board and yeah, exactly right. And and it's the best way to go, and then you get a couple of bottles of wine on your way. But it makes you appreciate, how hard you work for, what your earnings or what you can get for that money.
Sure.
For the next stage of your winemaking career, particularly when you're, obviously it's easier when you're young and single, and then obviously the travel, after that, the contacts that you have from working at those wineries, and they say, hey, go and visit X, X, Y, and Z in whatever regions of France or Italy or Spain. So, and that's what you go and do after vintage. You go and travel and visit those wineries who you've been recommended to go and see and learn more.
Where were some of the other places you did vintage in Europe?
Oh, blimey, I've done about 9 years there, just swapping hemispheres. So yeah, obviously Burgundy 03, Pix and Lou, so down near Montpellier in 04. I did a year in America in the Finger Lakes.
Really?
Yeah, up in upstate New York.
Where did you do that?
On Lake Keuka, Dr. Constantine Frank.
I've been there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he was the first guy to bring in vinifera grapes to America. Very successful. So great reason. And then down to Minervois, Gaillac.
Right.
I did a fair stint on the right bank, a couple of years in Pomerol, Saint-Emilion. I've been very fortunate. Chateau Lafleur, one of my great friends in Pomerol. I've been very fortunate to learn a lot off those guys. And then also Loire from Touraine, Puy-Fumé, and Saumur. So hence Shannon and Cab Franc, more Cab Franc Rosé. But from those guys. So yeah, so I've sort of been about a bit. And then been fortunate enough to then slide down to Chianti, not for vintage, but post-vintage, and at Isolina, and experienced that. And that was fantastic. But that was only like a 2 or 3 week stint afterwards.
Were you like me? Did you find it incredibly difficult to find that winery? Because I got lost.
I was with a Frenchman, so
lucky.
We were fine. But yeah, that was an amazing place.
Yeah,
that was incredible.
All the white buildings.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, so,
gorgeous.
My lasting memory of Isolina was where the cellar hands or work experience guys lived. They had this great big fireplace, and the mantelpiece was this big old piece of timber. It was about 10 inches deep.
Wow.
And there was all these chalk marks on it, like numbers, as if you've been in prison for how many days. And I asked the boys, what's all that about? And they were like, that's how many Riedel glasses were smashed during the vintage. So, never forget it for some reason.
So, past De Bordelais back here in Australia, what was the next step in the career?
Well, the last vintage De Borts went up to the Hunter at Margans, and then came back to De Borts in the 04 vintage. So it was in Hunter. Then, as I said, it was a year in America. So then after that was 06, I think it was, down in Tassie, when at Tamar Ridge, just when Guns took over. So Andrew Peary came on board, and so worked with him. And I was a night shift winemaker. So that was a great time. And then what was really interesting was after that vintage, Andrew was had taken over a little place called Rosevears, which I don't think exists anymore. But he had a lot of contract winemaking there, and was able to finish off a lot of the wines there until going back to Europe. So in about August. Then coming back when I was in France, I was then had the job opportunity to come here to Galli. That was 2007 was my first vintage.
Right.
Here at Galli. So here I've been since. But spent another 2 years at Galli, flicking between hemispheres.
What was the Galli story up till that point when you started?
The Galli story really was all about opportunity. It's only it's one of the closest wineries to the CBD of Melbourne.
Yeah.
So I was in Bordeaux at the time, and I remember applying for the job and also a job in the Barossa actually, and I got both jobs just as a vintage winemaker. And I'm like, which one do I take? And Galli was easy because having lived in Melbourne before when I was at RMIT, all my friends and so forth were here. So an opportunity to come back to Melbourne because I hadn't lived in a big city in 10 years. So it was great to, so Galli was an easy one. And then after that, it was fortunate enough that they wanted to keep me on, and I was still able to fly between hemispheres for a couple of years.
Yep.
And then at the end of 2009, beginning of 2010, a full-time job came available, and the previous winemaker to me left, and I took his job. So
opportunity, indeed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, indeed. Life's about opportunity at the end of the day. So I'm very lucky.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Galli at that point had already had like heavy investment in terms of alternative, particularly Italian varieties.
Mm-hmm.
And they had the Heathcote vineyard already at that point.
Yeah. They were all planted. The Sunbury vineyard was planted in '97, and the Heathcote 2001. That is. So well and truly invested in Mediterranean varieties in particular.
Yep.
So that was so obviously doing a couple of vintages here, developing an understanding of Italian or Mediterranean varieties was great to have that grounding, because previously it was really more cool climate orientated, traditional French varietals.
Sure. And certainly, the travels, be it in Australia, in the Finger Lakes, in Europe, certainly reflected that. A lot more time in France, for example.
Yeah, exactly right. So
was that a difficult transition to have a bit more focus on the Mediterranean varieties?
No, it wasn't actually. The Mediterranean varieties, no, it wasn't too hard actually. I thought it may well have been. I suppose the most challenging would be Nebbiolo, but no, it wasn't too much. It wasn't too hard at all actually.
Did you have an interest in Italian varieties, Italian wines up to that point?
No, not until I moved here, to be honest, to be
right.
totally frank. No, not until I moved here. I didn't realise, how great, Nebbiolo from Barolo or Barbaresco is, or how great. I knew how good Sange was from Tuscany, obviously being in there in 2003. But I didn't realise, and obviously now they're all the rage and they're all very expensive. And 10 years ago they were far more accessible and easily drunk. But no, I didn't really realise how iconic those varieties were and or would become. Not like all the focus. My grounding was all about lived with Bill Downey, for Christ's sake. So, he was all about Pinot. So all we drank was Grand Cru Pinot at the Borts all the time. And
we drank was Grand Cru Pinot.
Well, all we ate was pasta. We couldn't afford anything else.
I'm sorry, you're probably going to upset some listeners of the podcast saying stuff like that.
Yeah, you could afford it in those days, eh?
I have had previous guests who've been in the game for a lot longer, talking about, back in the day, we could get Romani Conti for a couple of $100. It's like, are you serious?
If only.
we can't even get it, let alone afford it.
That's right. Yeah, exactly right. It's amazing how things have changed. But so yeah, that influence, I suppose, that De Bortoli influence of particularly Burgundy was sort of I always go back to, I guess. But hey, if you can make Pinot Noir, which is one of the hardest grapes to make, the others should flow.
Sure. Sincerest apologies for interrupting another fascinating Vincast chat, but I wanted to mention the supporter of this episode of the podcast. So I'm speaking exclusively to the female listeners of the podcast who might happen to be at a wine event, a dinner or something like that in the city, and looking at a way to get home. Why not consider the new Australian Sheba app, which has been set up by women for women? Sheba is a safe and convenient form of transportation for female-only passengers, which makes you feel more comfortable because not only are all the drivers females themselves, but they also take home 85% of the revenue. So I highly recommend checking out the app and finding out if Sheba is available in your area. Get started with Sheba today. Visit the App Store or the Google Play Store to download the Sheba app and get riding in minutes. When you ride with Sheba, you're getting where you need to go and connecting with a ride-sharing community full of exceptional Australian women. Download the app today. So, how did you go about kind of looking at the Italian varieties and finding references and thinking about, because at that time there really wasn't a lot of wine made in Australia. It was still vines were being planted, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly right.
And they were reaching maturity, but there weren't a lot of people working with them. Did you kind of find opportunities to talk with people who were sort of pioneering with them in Australia?
Yeah, we did actually. There's two facets to that. Number one, I found that a lot of, particularly Sangiovese, which is probably the most widely planted Italian grape varietal 10 years ago. I'm not sure if it still is or not. But, a lot of Australian winemakers...
If you don't include Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris in there.
Oh, you might be right. Yeah, exactly. But, a lot of winemakers are making, Sange like Shiraz.
Yeah.
And it quite clearly isn't.
And blending as well.
Yeah, exactly right. Luckily enough, I think it was 2008 or 2009, my boss, Pam Galli, came up with an idea to represent her late husband, Lorenzo, for a scholarship in Italian wines. And so it's called the Lorenzo Galli Scholarship.
Yep.
So some of your viewers may have heard of it before, but it's basically a masterclass learning about, and benchmarking between Australia and obviously great Italian wines of the same variety.
Yep.
And learning about and teaching sommeliers, winemakers, viticulturists about, what are the benchmarks of Italy and why they're benchmarks, and then what's happening in Australia as well, and what's exciting about Australia with particularly Italian varietals. So through that masterclass, I've learned a phenomenal amount about Italian varieties, and when you have people like Mark Walpole, who's one of the I think one of the greatest viticulturists in Australia.
And he was awarded as such just recently.
And that was brilliant.
Someone I've been pestering to get on the show for a long time, but he's a bit of a shy fellow.
Well, he's amazing. When you do get him, he is an extraordinary wealth of knowledge with particularly Italian varieties, but viticulture in general is fantastic.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, having people like him on the panel to talk about Italian varieties from a viticultural point of view.
Sure.
And then having some winemakers. So I remember in the first years of the scholarship, we had blokes like Matt Gant from First Drop over in South Australia.
Yep.
He was doing, he was championing a lot in those days. Obviously, the Chalmers and Pizzinis would come in as well.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, the Pizzinis represented a fantastic flight of different clones of Nebbiolo out of barrel for one of the sessions in the masterclass.
Mm-hmm.
So and then just things like learning about the differences between traditional and more modern winemaking methods with Nebbiolo in Piemonte, which was quite a big conversation about 5 to 10 years ago. And across the board, you'll learn so much from the scholarship in benchmarking, these Italian wines. So I guess that's had a very big influence on what we do here at Galli, or what I've been doing with our Italian varietals. And then second to that, there's a Pinot Massive. I'm not sure if you know of it, with Victorian Pinot producers meeting up once a year,
mm-hmm.
And showing their wares in their barrel samples.
Okay.
And talking about Pinot, but it's Pinot specifically. But it still applies to a lot of other, it applies to winemaking in general, with what people are doing with, techniques or problem solving, or thinking outside the square. And that can lead into other interesting ideas and thinking outside the square for making, Fiano or Montepulciano or whatever other variety there is. So that's been really great too, that networking and talking about, wine and winemaking ideas. So
would you say that a really important part of the growth, the development of Mediterranean varieties, and particularly in Australia, couldn't have happened without a lot of people kind of working with them and collaborating to a certain extent, a community around them as far as the growers and the winemakers, and then having people traveling in Europe and having a reference point for those wines in Italy, in terms of journalists and sommeliers, and then for, at the end, the consumers to have an interest in those varieties. Do you think that it wouldn't have grown to what it is now without all of those things kind of working together?
Yeah, definitely. I think, obviously you go back to the nurseries who are bringing in those great varieties, and those guys championing, these new varieties into Australia, and that collaboration. But it's also timing. I think timing has a massive part in it, in the sense that
opportunity.
Well, exactly right. And everyone now, particularly cafes, restaurants, and bars, want something different.
Sure.
They want to have a Separavi, or they want to have a Nero d'Avolo or Aglianico or something or other. something a little bit different.
Tempranillo.
Yeah, Tempranillo, Sangiovese, Fiano, Montepulciano, etc. So stemming from that, timing played a big part in that. But also, us as Australian winemakers and viticulturists have learnt a lot about how to make it as well, and we are making it better as a group, as an industry. The wines have never been better.
Do you think that to a certain extent the Italian varieties were also grown like varieties that were a lot more planted in Australia? So like Sangiovese was grown like Shiraz as well?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that for sure. And you walk into the vineyard and look at Sangiovese, and it's quite a spindly variety.
Yep.
So, it doesn't look as healthy and as lush as the French varieties. And so to an untrained eye, someone might walk in and go, hey, that looks a bit sick.
Yep.
But it's Sangiovese. That's the way it always looks.
Sure.
And then also in the early days, a lot of the clones of those varieties that came in were selected on volume,
right,
to produce massive volume as well.
Yeah.
So the new clones that have come in the last 10 or 15 years are more selected on quality.
Because to a certain extent, that would have been the priority in Italy at the time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. These clones that were selected on quantity came through UC Davis in America.
Oh, right. Okay.
So they're all about volume. So we have one of those clones, for example, in Sangiovese. It's called the H6V9 clone, and it produces massive volumes, crops like no tomorrow. So viticulturally, we have to walk through the vineyard at least 3 times and dropping fruit.
Right.
Prior to and on veraison, to try and get that balance and then better concentration within that fruit.
Yep.
So whereas with Shiraz or with Cabernet, you wouldn't have to do that 3 or 4 times. You probably have to do it once.
Yeah.
Viticulturally, they're quite different as well.
Yeah. So as far as you taking on the winemaker position and working across the Sunbury and the Heathcote vineyard, how did you sort of start to evolve the way that the Galli wines looked over the past sort of 10 years?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, you try not to make drastic changes. You try to make it an evolution and tweak things and slowly move things in a direction. But, put simply, my predecessor was very corporate orientated, I suppose you'd say. So everything was inoculated, everything was stabilised, filtered, fined, etc. So it was pretty easy to change all that to more natural winemaking techniques. But number one is always balance in the vineyard first and foremost. And then when it comes into the winery, really we started tweaking with obviously like last year everything was 100% wild ferment, natural malos. All our premium wines are non-stabilised or filtered or fined. It's just racked on a new moon. I go according to the moon with our Adelaide wines, and have been doing so for about 6 or 7 years. I don't believe in fining. Fining's been a big one of mine, because from a winemaking point of view, if you have to fine the wine, i.e. to take out bitterness or astringency or some problem in the wine, then you need to look at where did that come from? What winemaking techniques brought that on? Was it because you macerated the fruit for too long, or you pumped over or plunged the wines for too long or too much, and you worked it too hard, and therefore you got that bitterness, or you pressed it too hard? Or what was that reasoning that you have to fine? So to avoid that, you need to look at your practices and how you make the wine in the first place during the vintage.
Yep.
So you learn from that in about how to respect certain varieties in certain ways. Tempranillo is very different to Nebbiolo, for example, in the way you macerate the fruit and extract that colour and tannin from the fruit. So because you don't want to come back to that wine and fine it later on before bottling, adding a bit of egg white or whatever it may be. So and then also I'm a big believer in recently changing the thought process with red wines with respect to pH, acidity. I think you can have quite low acidities, high pHs, and still have good wines. where the school of thought from university was, you have to have low pH, high acid to get you good sulfurs, et cetera, and have stable, clean wines. But I think that's a misnomer as well. So I've been changing that.
But also, as far as the wines from Italy, they probably don't do a lot of analysis. Obviously, they have a lot more experience and they know exactly well, not exactly, but they have an idea about what they're going to get. So they're just sort of going on sensory perception rather than looking at numbers.
Right. If it tastes good, then why add something or do something to the wine if you're happy with it where it is, regardless what the numbers are.
Yeah.
And that's probably my argument there. If it tastes good, then hello, it tastes good. And it's interesting because I make wine for about 10 or so clients and they have different, obviously, objectives and having that conversation with them is quite challenging sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's good to be challenged, So I'm trying to do that all the time. The other great thing too is I have a fantastic winemaker working with me, Kiralee Gordon, and so as a female, having a female palate and a female touch in the cellar. Not just the way you do things, but the way you make wine has been fantastic too. So that's been another really nice change in the last 2 years, having her in the winery.
Hasn't it been scientifically proven that women are actually much better in terms of sensory perception?
So. Yeah, exactly right. I'll take that any day. So it's good having her. And also, it doesn't become so Boise in the winery, and from a cultural point of view as well, it's great having her, and she's fantastic. So So a lot of credit needs to go to her as well because, we are a very small team, just the two of us. So it's great.
And one of the amazing things about Galli is that not only do you is some of the fruit that you grow available for purchase, but also the winery is available to some clients as far as being able to make their wines there.
Yep.
And I would imagine that it's a really great opportunity to sort of chat with other people and look at where the fruit that you're working with for Galli wines or for clients, and fruit that they're buying, looking at what they might be doing, is that also a fantastic opportunity to kind of, to compare notes and think about new techniques or ways of working with the fruit?
Yeah, look, that's definitely, and one of the big things there is we're based in Sunbury, and it's a very small wine region. There's only about 10 or 12 wineries in this region.
Sure.
And unlike, the Yarra or the Barossa or Margaret River, you can't just walk into the local pub and have a chat to another winemaker as they do at the Hillsville Hotel and share lots of knowledge and talk to other winemakers about what's happening in the region.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have that. So the way I get that is by having, these other, 10 or so clients who are working at Galli in the winery with us. And, because we're working together, we have some of them are ex-sommeliers making wine. Some of them are ex-winemakers from other companies making their own brands, etc. So, over a bottle of wine at lunch, always having a chat about, what we're doing, what they're doing, what other people are doing. Likewise, while we taste ferments together, while we're doing our rounds with Beaumets and so forth. So, that's really important, sharing and talking and finding out information about everyone's thoughts and ideas. Because you can always take, maybe 1% or 2% or 50% of an idea and give it a go. So a good example was in 2014. We had a big frost up at the Heathcote Vineyard.
Yeah.
And so we didn't get much fruit off that vineyard at all. So we had excess cellar hands here for the harvest because we had a lot less fruit. And with the Sunbury Syrah, we were talking about it, and we're like, well, let's do a bit of hand destemming. No destemmer, no crusher, no machine. So hand picked, then painstakingly berry by berry, pulled off a bunch into a pungent. And it took, the cellar hands wanted to kill me, I think, because it took 4 of them all day to do one barrel. And that wine's now one of our stables. We do it every year now. And it's been fantastic. So that wouldn't have come about if that vintage didn't happen. And also, talking to the other guys about, hey, at Chateau Le Gay, I think it is, who do that in Pomerol, they, individually take berry by berry.
Well, they do it at La Postole in Chile.
There's a few places that do it. Yeah, exactly right. So, but you got to give it a go.
Labour's a little bit cheper in other parts of the world, though.
yeah. But that's why we only do one pungent. Although this year we did 3, I have to admit. So, I've got better. We've got better at doing it. So,
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for example, we've got a larger hole in the barrel. It's 3 inches rather than a 1 inch hole.
Yeah.
And it's easier to feed the berries into the barrel, etc. So
with that, the origin in terms of viticulture and working in the vineyard, and having worked with Galli, has it been great to also have an opportunity to work more with the vineyard and sort of being there all year round and sort of looking at the different cycles that the vines go through?
Yeah, well, here at Galli we have 2 vineyard managers because both vineyards are quite large. One's 100 acres, one's 200. So those guys really, it's their own little domain, obviously, and I work closely with them. And obviously that they're viticulturists, so we're obviously sharing information as well and ideas. But from my own personal point of view, 4 years ago, my wife and I bought a vineyard in the Macedon Ranges. And so now I've inadvertently become a viticulturist myself, so back to being in the vineyard. In my spare time, that is, on weekends and when I get home from work. And I've learnt so much. It, and every winemaker knows all the principles, and we know what the viticulturists are doing. But when you're doing it yourself, you're far more in touch with the vineyard, particularly when you're pruning yourself or you're shoot thinning or lifting wires or whatever it may be. So you're walking down every row all the time, looking at the fruit or the vines, and assessing the health and what have you. And I get a consultant in to help as well, because I don't know it all and I need someone else to oversee and get advice from.
Well, working in a different region again, Macedon
exactly
is more elevated, cool climate region, so that must be quite challenging to kind of step into that to that vineyard with a clean slate for as far as a regional climate kind of perspective.
Yeah, well, it's so different to Sunbury and Heathcote, definitely. Obviously, the 2 warmer climates, but Macedon's actually not dissimilar to Tumbarumba, where I grew up.
There you go.
It's one of, I think, I'm not sure what the debate is between the 2 regions of Macedon and Tumbarumba. They're the coolest mainland regions in Australia. So
right.
Tassie's the coldest in Australia, and then within mainland Australia, it's either Macedon or Tumbarumba.
Yep.
They're both neck and neck, I believe. So
all 3 places great for Chardonnay.
Hello, yeah, exactly right. So anyway, but obviously my grounding's Tumbarumba, so I'm at cool climates, no worries. So, and my father's been fantastic too, and mum as well,
right.
in guidance and help in the vineyard too.
Do they still have the vineyard?
No, they sold it about 15 years ago.
Right.
But Dad loves jumping on a tractor, so and helping out. They're great just to have a chat to, and they understand what I'm talking about because they've done it for 20 years. So any advice from them is great as well. Are
you making any wine from the Macedon vineyard?
Yeah, I have my own label. Sal and I released it November last year. It was the old Portree vineyard that Ken and Lynn Murchison planted in 1982. So it's one of the oldest.
Good vintage.
Yeah, you bet. It's one of the oldest oldest vineyards in the region.
Wow.
So we had our first vintage was 2015, and I've been selling most of the fruit, and we have 3 barrels of Pinot and 5 of Chardonnay. So and we've released it under a new label called Wilimee, because we have an Aboriginal quarry next door to us. It's one of the oldest in the country. It's 1,500 years old, and it's a heritage listed quarry.
Oh, wow.
And the quarry, the Aborigine called it Wilimee Mooring, meaning place of tomahawk or stone axe.
Yep.
So we wanted to bring the name back to our locality, so hence we've renamed it Wilimee. It's been fantastic. So I've only had 1 year of sales, and the 16 vintage will be released in a month's time.
Right, and people are able to buy that directly, or there's some retail partners?
Mostly directly on our website. We don't have much volume, so there's a couple of wine shops that have been great supporters in Melbourne, Black Hearts and Sparrows and Smalls Wine Bar. So they've been fantastic.
We removed former guests of the podcast.
Oh, there you go.
Actually, one of the original guests of the podcast, but recent guests of the podcast, John Harris, talked about the fruit for Sabre for the Mitchell Harris sparkling wines, which I'm a big fan of.
Yeah, Jono's been on board for a couple of years. He's been buying fruit from us for sparkling.
Yeah.
But he was getting fruit from our vineyard when he worked at Domaine Chandon, I believe.
Exactly.
So
that's what he talked about.
Okay.
But that was the first vineyard that he bought from when they were studying Mitchell Harris.
Ah, there you go.
The first vintage of Sabre.
Yeah, righto. Gotcha. Well, he's back on board and has been for the last 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I sell a few tons of fruit to him, and also to Josh Cooper.
Yep.
And
former guest of the podcast.
Oh, there you go. That's good. And Matt Harriff. So
not a future guest, hopefully.
So those 3 guys have been fantastic. Good people to deal with, and
all outstanding winemakers.
Yeah, and that's the other great thing too, is that sharing that information with those guys as well. And obviously we've all got the same fruit. And actually I'll get them up next month actually for lunch, and we'll all have our barrel samples of Chardonnay.
Yep.
And the previous vintage, and we'll all come up for lunch and have a chat about each other's wines.
Yeah,
and
great.
They will be all very different. And so it's amazing the differences of what winemakers can do with the same fruit.
And very much taking you back to that original European vintage in terms of Burgundy, working with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and cooler climates. So that must be exciting, having that sort of little project for yourself, and then taking Galli into the future and trying different things, and again having that contact with the people who are working with the wines in terms of the Lorenzo Galli Scholarship. So it looks like you've got lots and lots of really awesome projects you're working on, and it has been great chatting with you and finding a bit more about your background. So thank you very much. As far as social media accounts for and websites for Galli and for Wilimee?
Yeah, all the usual channels with Galli. Obviously, our website www.galliestate.com.au. We're also on Twitter. It's actually under my name, Ben_Ranken. So on my Twitter, I represent Galli. And then with respect to Wilimee, we have our own website, which is wilimee.com.au. Sorry, say again, wilimewines.com.au. And then obviously Instagram, Wilimee Wines as well, Wilimee_wines.
Awesome.
And Facebook for Wilimee, but my wife does that, so she's far better than me.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to following everything that you're doing, and it's been great catching up.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us on this episode of the Vincast. I have been James Garesbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and you can follow me on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm at Intrepid Wino, and you can follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. Head to my YouTube channel, which is Intrepid Wino, one word. Check out some of the Let's Taste videos, including a couple of new Galli Estate wine tasting videos. And there's also you can check out my my series chronicling my winemaking experiences and some other stuff as well. Subscribe, make sure to leave a comment, like, and share the videos if you can. I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Player FM, Podbean, iHeartRadio. I think it's going to be on Spotify soon. Subscribing to the podcast means you can get the episodes as soon as they become available, and you can access the entire back catalogue going all the way back to episode 1. So subscribing also helps to grow the podcast, as does leaving a rating and a review. I'd love to hear from you. Come and visit me at intrepidwino.com. Lots of content there, as well as ways of getting in contact with me. And do check out how to get tickets to the Vincast Live episode on 5th of December. If you can't join us, there will be a live streaming option, so prepare some questions for myself and the guests. But hopefully I'll get to see you in person. But until then, bye.
Earbuds, Melbourne's podcast network. earbudsnetwork.com